Well, good morning or good afternoon, as it may be right now. Geometry class. Can you believe it's already third period? Well, what we're going to do today, right now, is we're going to talk about this idea of conditionals. Okay, so if you have something with which to write and something on which to write, now would be a great time to have those things because I'm going to need you to write some things down. All right, so we're going to talk about conditionals. And you may be familiar with the word, you may not be, but the idea of a conditional, it's really simple. Before you leave today and walk through that door, you have better know what a conditional is. And a conditional is this. It is an if-then statement. That's it. A conditional is an if-then statement. Any statement that you would say that is if this and then that, it's a conditional. And you think about that. You say, if you do this for me, I will do that for you on one condition. That word is just connected with the idea of if-then statements. Okay, so what I'd like you to do right now is I want you to take just a few seconds and come up with, on your own, some if-then statement. It can involve you, it can involve this class, it can involve your family, it doesn't matter. I want you to come up with one if-then statement. All right, hopefully you've got it, and I'd like you to write it down because we're going to keep referring back to it. If you were unable to think of anything, I'm going to write one down, and so if you're still writing yours down, that's great. I'm going to write mine down, and you can, from this point on, use mine or yours, it doesn't matter. Ready? I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to say, if it is raining, then you will get wet. Okay, and you might argue whether this is true or false or something like that, and that doesn't really bother me a whole lot. What I'm saying is, I'm just looking at this idea. If it's raining, you're going to get wet. All right, and I think there is a lot of truth to that, because even on days that I go, well, it's raining, but I carried an umbrella, I wore a rain jacket, I walked under the walkway. At some point, somehow, one drop from somewhere drips on me, and so I can argue I got wet. So if it's raining, then you will get wet. Okay, so that's my conditional. Now, as we look at conditionals, what I want us to see is that every conditional has a couple parts. It's got, of course, an if and a then, because that's why we call it an if-then statement. But after the if is this other thing right here. Everything in between the if and the then, that has a name. It's called the hypothesis. The hypothesis is the condition that needs to be fulfilled for the whole statement to be true. Okay? So in this case, it is raining. Not if it is raining, but it is raining is the hypothesis. That's the hypothesis. And the part after the then, everything back here, this is called the conclusion. Okay? And so we have, and now the conclusion is you will get wet. The conclusion doesn't have the then in it. The hypothesis doesn't include the if, and the conclusion does not include the then. So it's always if, hypothesis, then conclusion. So when I say if it is raining, then you will get wet, the hypothesis is it is raining. The conclusion is you will get wet. All right, so this is really simple. But here on out, everyone should know and should be able to identify, if you read a conditional, you should be able to identify what the hypothesis is and what the conclusion is. And remember that the hypothesis is just that condition that needs to be fulfilled for the whole statement to be true or for the conclusion to happen. All right. Now, with that in mind, what I want to do is I want to talk about how if you're given some sentence, how you could convert that sentence to a conditional. All right. So let's take a look at one. Example number 1. It says, write the statement as a conditional. You can register to vote if you are at least 18 years old. Now, this is kind of unusual because we see this if in the middle there. And it says, well, write it as a conditional. Well, technically, this still is a conditional. It's just not written in the form that we like. We like it written if, then, okay? And so what we do is we go, well, there's the if. So believe it or not, all of this right here is still then the hypothesis. It's everything after the if. And so if I was going to write this as an if-then statement, I would say if are at least 18 years old, then you can register to vote. You can register to vote. Okay? And what I want you to do is I want you to think about that. This part right here, of course, is the hypothesis. And this part right here is the conclusion. Every time you write one of these, you should be able to identify what is the hypothesis and what is the conclusion. And see, how this statement was written originally, that's kind of a lot of times how we speak. You know, you might say something like, man, I'll buy you a snow cone if you run 20 miles. And just so you know, that's true. If anyone in this class runs 20 miles, I'd happily buy you a snow cone. You have to run 20 all at one time, though. You can't run like half a mile every day for 40 days. But so a lot of times when we speak in normal language, we do kind of throw that if in the center. And so, but we should be able to take a statement like that and make sure we can still write it as an if-then statement. Remember, it's always if, hypothesis, then conclusion. Okay, well, let's take even another statement, almost more like a defining statement, okay? We might have something like this. A square must have 4 congruent sides, all right? So what if we were going to try to convert that to an if-then statement, to a conditional? Now, I'll tell you, if I just go ahead and ask you to do this without giving any instruction, almost everybody does this wrong. They hear this idea about this thing having 4 congruent sides, and it sounds like that's the condition. Like that's the thing that has to be fulfilled. But that's not how this one is really set up. That really is the conclusion. And this right here, believe it or not, is the condition. That's the thing that has to happen. So what you could say is you might even have to add a word or two. You could say if something is a square, or if a shape is a square, or if a polygon is a square. But if something is a square, then it must have 4 congruent sides. It's that simple. If something is a square, then it must have 4 congruent sides. And so then again, I should be able to look back at this and go, okay, where's my hypothesis? Everything right here, that's the hypothesis, and everything right here, that's the conclusion. Okay? So the hypothesis is something is a square. The conclusion is it must have 4 congruent sides. If something is a square, then it must have 4 congruent sides. Okay? And that's true. That's a true statement. Just as this original statement is true. A square must have 4 congruent sides. That's true. But see, if we were to switch this around, if we wrote this wrong and said if it must have 4 congruent sides, then something is a square, or then it is a square, that's not true. Because a rhombus has 4 congruent sides, but it's not necessarily a square. And so that's where, if the original statement was true, well, then when we write a conditional, that should certainly be true. All right? So here we go. Let's cover what we got so far. Conditionals. Conditionals are if-then statements. And every conditional has 2 parts. It's got a hypothesis and a conclusion. It's always if hypothesis, then conclusion. All right? So now what I want you to do is I want you to try to do these 2 on your own. You're going to try to take these 2 statements and write them as conditionals. So we'll probably need to pause the video here for just a minute or 2 to kind of give everybody a chance. But right now on your paper, write these statements as conditionals. You don't have to write the statements as they are. They're up on the board. But write them as a conditional. So go ahead and pause it here, and then we'll look at them in just a minute. All right. Hopefully you're ready now. And let's take a look at these, okay? It says a triangle with all angles congruent is equilateral. A triangle with all angles congruent is equilateral. Okay, and so we hear this and we go, okay, what is the condition and what is the conclusion? What's the hypothesis? What's the part that has to be fulfilled? And then what is the result? And this one, the hypothesis, just like before, but it's with the square, we said if something is a square, period. Because it said a square must have blah, blah, blah. But for this one, it gives us more than that. It says a triangle with all congruent angles is something. So I would say that this part in the front is really the hypothesis, this whole thing, not just this little part. And again, the tail end is the conclusion. So I would say if a triangle if a triangle is such that all angles are congruent, if a triangle's angles are all congruent, then it is, let's move this guy down just a little bit, then it is equilateral. Okay? If a triangle's angles are all congruent, oh, my G disappeared. Oh, there it is. If a triangle's angles are all congruent, then it is equilateral. Okay? It's also equiangular. But that's how I would go ahead and write this. So here's my hypothesis. A triangle's angles are all congruent. And here's my conclusion. It is equilateral. All right? Let's take a look at this next one. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all this for a second. Now, please understand, you may have written yours just a little bit different. These have a little bit of kind of a room to, you can change them a little bit. All right? It doesn't have to be exact. Sometimes you might put in one little word or take out a little word that I don't. And so they might have a little bit of a different sound to them, but that's okay. All right, let's take a look at this next one. It says, Alberto can go to the movies if he washes the car. So again, this is a lot of times how we speak, but they threw the if in the middle. And we want to write these as an if-then statement. And so when writing this one, I'm going to say if. Now, I could say if he washes the car, but I haven't mentioned who he is yet. So typically, I would probably move that around and say, if Alberto washes the car. If Alberto washes the car, then what? Then he can go to the movies. Now, hopefully you got this one. There wasn't really a whole lot of moving around or changing on this one. It was pretty simple. Again, we should be able to look at and go, okay, so this part right here is the hypothesis. Alberto washes the car. This part right here is the conclusion. He can go to the movies. If he does this, then he can do that. All right, pretty simple so far. So now let's move on. Okay, now that we talked about conditionals, and the conditional is made up of a hypothesis and a conclusion, we've got to bring something new in. We got to talk about a converse. Okay, a converse is a conditional that's been flipped around. Okay, so think about my conditional I had earlier, and if you wrote one, I'd really like for you to look at yours. Okay, so the one I had earlier was, if it is raining, then you will get wet. Okay? Now, a converse, all you do is you have to identify what the hypothesis is and what the conclusion is, and then you simply switch them. Okay? And that's what a converse is. So a converse can't be anything on its own. You can only have a converse of a statement. You can't say, hey, this right here all by itself is a converse. A converse is basically saying it's the opposite or the flipped around version of a conditional. And so right here it says, if it is raining, then you will get wet. All right? So the converse would be if. Now this is where it gets a little bit weird because we might have to change the verb conjugation a little bit. We might have to just alter it just a little bit. Instead of saying if you will get wet, because that sounds a little bit weird, maybe say if you got wet. You know, we want to be careful about it. If you get wet. So I might drop the will. If you get wet, then it is raining. Okay, now while I would argue that this original statement right here, I would argue that that is true. I think that if it's raining, man, at some point in the day, I'm just going to step out underneath an awning, underneath something, and I'm going to get at least one little drip on me, and I'm going to get wet. But I would never argue that this is true. If you get wet, then it's raining. Absolutely not. When you took a shower this morning, when you got wet, that doesn't mean that automatically outside it was raining. If you jump in a pool and you get wet, that does not mean that automatically it is raining. So this statement is clearly not true, okay? Just because you get wet does not mean it is raining. All right, and so sometimes a conditional is true, but the converse of that conditional is not true, not even a little bit. And so sometimes you flip it around and it won't be true. Now, sometimes when you flip it around, it will be true. And that's what's interesting. But there's a lot of times where you flip it around and it won't be. So what I want you to do, if you haven't done it yet, is I want you to write the converse of your statement, okay? And I want you to decide whether that is true or not. So take a look at that. We might have to pause this for just a minute. All right, now that you've done that, you've established whether that was true or not, everyone should still understand a conditional, hypothesis and conclusion. It's an if-then statement. Converse, you switch the hypothesis and conclusion, you get a different if-then statement, which may or may not be true. All right, moving on. Okay, so what I want to do right now is I want to look and see, they've given us a conditional, and I want to look at the converse of that and see if the converse is true or not. The original conditional they give us says, if you play the trumpet, then you play a brass instrument. Now that's true. A trumpet is a brass instrument. And so I know if you play the trumpet, then you play a brass instrument. Well, what would be the converse? The converse would be if you, now we're not going to say play the trumpet, but we're going to say if you play a brass instrument. If you play a brass instrument, and then what would be the conclusion this way when we switch around? Then you play the trumpet. Okay? If you play a brass instrument, then you play the trumpet. And is that true? No. There's plenty of other brass instruments that are not trumpets. You could play a trombone, or you could play a big old tuba, or I'm sure there's a handful of others. I'm not a music expert. But either way, one of the things I know, this statement is not true. While the conditional was true, this converse is not true. Okay, and so it just again shows us that sometimes even when you have a true conditional, your converse is not going to be true. Okay, so let's move on. Now we got to talk about a completely different idea. We got to talk about this idea called negations. Okay, so what is a negation? Now you kind of hear in the root there, you've got like negate or negative. So there's something there. And if you think about, one number, one number versus the negative of that number, they're kind of like opposites. And so there's something in that idea. But the negation is basically a statement that has the opposite truth value of another statement. Okay? And so I could say something like, it is raining. Okay, nothing hard. It is raining. If I was to negate that, or the negation of that statement, would just simply be, it is not raining. Notice all I did there was just go ahead and put in that not right here. And I said, it is raining. If I wanted to negate that, I'd say, it is not raining. Okay, basically every negation just sounds like that annoying 4-year-old little brother, just constantly arguing with whatever it is you'd say. Now this works though the other way, that if I have a not in a statement, then you've got to take that out because it's got to become the opposite. So if I say, for instance, I am not hungry, the negation of that statement would be, I am hungry. Okay? And so those are negations of each other. This time, I took the not and I threw it out the window. I didn't want it. Okay? This first statement, it didn't have a not, so I had to put one in. The second statement had a not, so I had to take it out. Okay? And that's how negations work. We don't need to spend too much time on this because they're too easy. Okay? But let me give you a couple examples. If I said third period, geometry is my best class. Well, what would be the negation of that? Well, the negation would be that third period geometry is not, sorry guys, my best class. Now, I'm not saying which one is true, but I'm just saying that's a negation of the first one. And then you might have a statement like, geometry is not the most fun ever. And of course, that's obviously not true, but the negation would be. The negation would be that geometry is the most fun ever. Okay? And that's the negation of that statement. For that one, I had to take the not out. For the other one, I had to put a not in. All right? Pretty easy. Now, the reason why we talked about negations is because now what we're going to do is we're going to use those in the conditionals. Remember, a conditional is an if-then statement with a hypothesis and conclusion, and a converse just simply switches the hypothesis and conclusion. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about an inverse. We have conditional, we have converse, now we have inverse. And an inverse is really simple, okay? An inverse is just a conditional. And this is just looking a little bit too sloppy. I don't know why, but that's all right. I'll try to get rid of that. All right, so what's an inverse? An inverse is a conditional whose hypothesis and conclusion have been negated. Okay? So it'll sound very different. Okay? But an inverse is just a conditional whose hypothesis and conclusion have been negated. So let's go back to that example that I've used over and over and over. Okay? And I have this example. If it is raining, and I'd love for you to use your example right now, because I would love to, as you look at that one, you can kind of think about how you can write an inverse off that one. If it is raining, then you will get wet. Okay? If it is raining, then you will get wet. Now let's talk about what the inverse would be. Well, I just, like it says, I have to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion. So that's pretty simple. But yet some people still mess it up because they just want to negate one part or the other. But please understand, you got to negate both. So if it is not raining, then you will not get wet. And now here's the question. If I want to argue that this first statement is true, if it's raining, then you will get wet, and you've heard my argument on that. My question is, what about this second statement? Is that true? If it is not raining, then you will not get wet? What do you guys think? Well, when I think about that, that's certainly not true. Just because it's not raining doesn't mean I won't somehow get wet. Again, I could go to the pool, I could walk in front of a sprinkler. Yesterday I ran outside. It wasn't raining, but man, was I wet. I was soaking wet with just sweat, and I know it's gross. But anyway, so just because it's not raining doesn't mean that I'm not going to get wet. So again, when we have a conditional, we said when we do the converse, it may be true, but it might not be. And when we do the inverse, it may be true, or it might not be. All right? So let's move on, okay? What we're going to do now is we are going to look at one last thing, and those are called contrapositives. Okay, a contrapositive. Now that's kind of a cool big word, but a contrapositive is basically, it's really simple, but my definition for it sounds incredibly confusing. A contrapositive is the inverse of a converse. Or you could say it is the converse of an inverse. It's that simple. And I know that sounds really confusing, but think about that for a second. What does that really mean? What does that say that a contrapositive is? Well, it's the inverse of a converse. Well, think about that. What is inverse? Inverse is when you negate each part. And what is a converse? The converse is when you switch each part. And so then if you look at this other definition, I said, well, it's the converse, well, that's when I switch it, of an inverse, and that's when I negate it. So ultimately, what is a contrapositive? Well, a contrapositive is just that. you have to switch the hypothesis and conclusion, and you negate them, okay? So, if I have that statement one last time, if it is raining, then you will get wet. Let's think about what a contrapositive would be. It would be if, now we got to look at the conclusion and negate it. If you will get wet. How about if you don't get wet? If you don't get wet, then now I got to look at the hypothesis and negate that. Then it is not raining. Now think about this. I know there's so many knots in this statement that it's difficult to think through, but think through this. If you don't get wet, if you make it through the whole day and you don't get wet, you don't get in the pool, no shower, no running, no nothing, you don't get wet, then it is not raining. And that's absolutely true. If this first statement's true, if it's raining, then you're going to get wet. Well, then there's no way we could make it through the whole day and not get wet and it still be raining. So we can conclude that this is true. If you don't get wet, then it is not raining. And so that gets us to this little rule that if the original statement is true, then always the contrapositive is true. And this is nice because we were having all that, like if the one's true, then the other one might be or might not be. But this is a constant. If the original is true, then the contrapositive will be true. And it works all the time like that. You know, you can use all sorts of conditionals. If the original is true, then the contrapositive will be true. All right? Okay, we're going to look at just a little bit more, not much, but we got to look at biconditionals before we get done, and then we are going to be done. So biconditionals. A biconditional is really simple. A biconditional is when you have a statement that both the original and the converse are true. Okay? When both the original and the converse are true, then you can write something called a biconditional. Okay, I might have something and say, I know this might be kind of lame, but I'm going to use a math example, and that's all right. Okay, I might say something like, if two lines intersect, at a right angle, then they are, by definition, perpendicular, because that's what perpendicular means. Perpendicular means to intersect at a right angle. So if two lines intersect at a right angle, then they are perpendicular. And so then if you look at this and you switch it around, so there's my conditional. If I switch it around and look at the converse, well, what's the converse? The converse is going to be if two lines, now I know two lines was part of the hypothesis, but I can still kind of keep that part up front, so that way I don't move the they up to the front and not know what I'm talking about. If two lines are perpendicular, then what? Then they intersect at a right angle. Absolutely. The first one's true. If two lines intersect at a right angle, then they are perpendicular. The second one's true. If two lines are perpendicular, then they intersect at a right angle. And if this is the case, if you get both a conditional and a converse that are both true, what you can do is you can write what's called a biconditional. And a biconditional just means, biconditional. Biconditional means what you're going to do is you're going to take the hypothesis and you're going to write that first. And then you're going to put in the middle, if and only if. And then after that, you're going to write the conclusion. Oops. Okay? So it goes hypothesis, if and only if, conclusion. That's how you write a biconditional. Literally, you use these words, if and only if. Okay? And so what I want to do right here is I'm going to write the example of this one. Okay? we'll go to about there. Okay, and so this one, and the neat thing is you can write the hypothesis of either one. Because it's true both ways, they're kind of interchangeable. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this. I'm going to say 2 lines intersect at a right angle if and only if they are perpendicular. That's a biconditional. It always has if and only if in the middle. So you could say this right here is my hypothesis, and this part right here is my conclusion. And you could flip-flop the whole thing, both the hypothesis and the conclusion, and it'd still be true. It'd still say the same thing because it was true either way. All right, so that's a biconditional. A biconditional is when you have both true conditional and converse. You can combine them with the phrase if and only if in the middle, and you can write hypothesis, if and only if, conclusion, and then you get what's called a biconditional. Now, likewise, if you have a biconditional, you can tear it apart into the 2 statements that created it. This one says a triangle is equilateral if and only if it has 3 congruent sides. So think about that. There was actually 2 conditionals that created this. You could say if a triangle, if a triangle is equilateral, then it has 3 congruent, I'm just going to use the symbol, save myself a little bit of room, congruent sides. Okay? If a triangle is equilateral, then it has 3 congruent sides. And the other statement that would make it is if a triangle has 3 congruent sides, then it is equilateral. See, it says what are the 2 conditionals implied by the biconditional? So we'd have to come up with both. If a triangle is equilateral, then it has 3 congruent sides. And if a triangle has 3 congruent sides, then it is equilateral. One biconditional should always be able to give us 2 conditionals. Okay? All right. So now, super fast review. What in the world is a conditional? Well, it is an if-then statement. Okay? We got to know that. What is the hypothesis? Well, the hypothesis is after the if, and it's before the then. What's the conclusion? Well, that's everything after the then. That's kind of a hard, weird statement to say, after the then. Okay, what's a converse? Well, a converse is when we switch. What do we switch about it? We switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, we switch it around. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it won't be true. What does it mean to negate something? Well, to negate something means just you either add not or you take out not from a statement so that it has the opposite truth value. What's an inverse? Well, an inverse was in reference to a conditional, and an inverse was when we negate what? What do we negate? Have we forgotten that? That one was a while ago. We negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion, not just one or the other. And then lastly, what's a contrapositive? A contrapositive was when we negate them. Negate the hypothesis and conclusion and switch them. Okay? Remember, it was the converse of the inverse. All right. Well, hopefully at this point you're feeling pretty ready to go. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and get started on your homework. And for homework, what we're going to do is I've looked through these problems and I think they're real straightforward and simple. So I think you should be fine. But on page 42, what I'd like you to do is look at numbers 19 through 32. Now here's my rule. All right, I don't want you guys to have a ton of homework. Hopefully you get a little bit of time right now in class to work on this. And then as you go home to work on it, if for some reason you were at home and you worked on this and this alone for a half hour, 30 minutes, and you're still not done, you can call it a day, okay? If you can look me in the eye and say, man, I worked on it at home for 30 minutes straight, didn't do anything, wasn't on my phone, no TV, no nothing, and I still didn't finish, that's okay. I'm not looking for you to have hours of homework, but I want you to at least give it a solid try. All right, I hope you have a great day and you're able to do this well. I'll see you soon. Bye.